Hello, today we're gonna be having a zoom through the start of the Kierkegaard collection. I'm gonna read out the passages quick as you like, and then I'm gonna talk about what they mean. I'm gonna surmise them in layman's terms, because in this book here is the key to the mystery of the disquietened mind. And this isn't for everybody. This isn't for folk that don't want to find meaning, are perfectly happy, or they need something that's deeper and more established. Like if you read Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre is horrible because it's too well founded, and he wastes 99% of his books just waffling on. You don't need that to understand what he's getting at. And with Kierkegaard, he just does a wee framework. There's a whole lot of assertions and assumptions. The foundation of his is it comes for 2,000 years. It comes for the good old book. So there's 2,000 years of foundation behind his, whereas Sartre had to write tomes to establish this without the lore. Here we go. Bright and cheerful. The sickness unto death is despair. That despair is the sickness unto death. Despair is the sickness of the spirit, not the self, and so it may assume a triple form. And despair at not being conscious of having a self, despair at not willing to be oneself, despair at willing to be oneself. Man is a spirit, but what is spirit? Spirit is the self, but what is the self? The self is a relation which relates itself to its own self, or it is that in relation that the relation relates itself to its own self. The self is not the relation, but that the relation relates itself to its own self. Man is a synthesis of the finite and infinite, the temporal and eternal, of freedom and necessity. In short, it is a synthesis. A synthesis is a relation between two factors. So regarded, man is not yet a self. In the relation between the two, the relation as the third term is negative unity. And the two relate themselves to the relation, and in the relation to the relation, such a relation is that between the soul and body. When man is regarded as so, if, on the contrary, the relation relates itself to its own self, the relation is then the positive third term, and this is the self. Such a relation, which relates itself to its own self, must either have constituted itself or have been constituted by another. If this relation, which relates itself to its own self, is constituted by another, the relation doubtless is the third term. This relation is in turn a relation relating itself to that which constituted the whole relation. Such a derived constituted relation is the human self, a relation which relates itself to its own self, and in relating itself to its own self relates itself to another. Hence, it is that there can be two forms of despair, properly so called. If the human self has constituted itself, there could be a question of only one form, that of not willing to be oneself, of willing to get rid of oneself, but there would be no question of despairingly willing to be oneself. This formula is the expression for the total dependence of the relation, the expression for the fact that the self cannot itself attain and remain in equilibrium and the rest by itself. And only by relating itself to that power, he's talking about the unity or God, and only by relating itself to that power which constituted the whole relation. Indeed, so far as does from being true that the second form of despair denotes only a particular kind of despair, that on the contrary all despair can be in the last analysis reduced to this. If a man in despair is as he thinks conscious of his despair, does not talk about it meaninglessly or as of something which befell him, and if by himself and by himself only he would wish to abolish the despair, then by all the labour he expends, he is only labouring himself deeper and deeper into despair. The disrelationship of despair is not a simple disrelationship, But a disrelationship is a relation which relates itself to its own self and is constituted by another. So the disrelationship in the self-relation reflects itself infinitely in the relation to the power which constituted it. This then is the formula which describes the condition of the self when despair is completely eradicated, by relating itself to its own self and by willing to be itself. The self is grounded transparently in the power which posited it. So there. The central idea is that the despair is a condition of the self, not just an emotion, and it's deeply tied to what it means to be human. So Kierkegaard starts by defining the self as a kind of relationship. This was his first assertion. A synthesis of opposites, like infinite, finite, temporal, eternal, and that it relates to itself. In simple terms, the self isn't something you are, it's something you constantly become by relating properly to who you are. Right, so from that foundation, he introduces despair as a sickness of the spirit. Unlike physical illness, this sickness doesn't necessarily lead to death. In fact, that's the paradox. The sickness unto death is a condition where a person is completely misaligned but continues to live. So the key points are the self can be out of balance. That happens when the relationship within the self is misaligned, either by ignoring parts of itself or failing to integrate them properly. Point number 2, despair is universal, but often hidden. Many people are in despair without realising it. They may seem fine externally, but internally they are disconnected from their true self. And point 3, despair is not equal to sadness. It's not just feeling bad, it's a deeper existential condition of not being properly grounded as a self. The sickness, point number 4, the sickness unto death is spiritual, not physical. The tragedy is not dying, but living in a state where one's true self is not realised. There are different forms of despair. They're introduced here, they're elaborated on later, and those are not being aware that you have a self, which is ignorant despair, not wanting to be yourself, wanting to be yourself but failing to ground it properly. In short, you can surmise it by saying that to be human is to have a self, and to have a self is to risk despair. Despair arises when we fail to become who we truly are, especially in relation to a deeper spiritual grounding, which he would tie to God. So in my youth, coming out of my youth and having the disquieting mind and wrestling with it for the last 20 years, I came to the conclusion that it was a lot of environmental factors. Number 1 being that I had to recover for religion. I would not be as tormented as I am if I had not had the added confuser of religiosity being the foundation of my mental and personality formation. And I think breaking for that did a lot of damage. The fact that it was instilled in me was something that needed corrected. And it was unnecessarily instilled for me because we weren't at war. We weren't being attacked, although for the Baptist perspective we're surrounded by sinners. So there was this unity against the antagonist, the barbarian horde, the Islamist, just the sinner in any form. So I feel like maybe I had to break free of the conditioning for a war that I never was in. I was conditioned for a battle that doesn't exist. Because everything exists in the grey area. Yeah, so if you take the assumption for the higher power out of it, and you replace that with like tough environmental factors during the formation, speech, language, communication, and the God idea, then that brings you to where Robert Spilowski is in behaviour, and it also brings you to the Ernest Becker, the denial of death, the cope. Why don't we just collapse to our knees in existential dread, since we have godlike consciousness? We've talked a lot about self-deception, being almost limitless, and this is part of it. So as I said at the start, this isn't for everybody, and I can't even guarantee it's for people that weren't lived in a heavily religious upbringing like I was. But I believe that it may well be, because, like it or no, religiosity is part of our makeup. It evolved along with the modern man, along with the ideas of social group dominance, along the ideas of, the biblical idea we're a race of families, like the early Israelites, the unity of the tribes of Israel against their common enemy, and then right up to like ultra huge nationalistic racial prioritization, like the Germanics are the best, or the blacks are the best, or the Iranians are the best, the Persians, whatever. So it goes all the way back through history to the evolution of speech and the evolution of social frameworks and laws, right up to law giving. Like it or no, this is a framework for quieting the mind. It's particularly for those who have wrestled with the idea of sin, the fall of man, like what we are versus the ideal. What we're supposed to be, which is like godlike, Jesus-like. The introduction of the conscience. What I used to say about my misdeeds was that if there's no God to judge me, then I have to judge me, and that was me stuck in the mire of trying to break free of the framework. And when you struggle, when you're in a bog, all you do is sink deeper into the bog. And then, just for me, that's what I experienced. So I don't want to. I'm keen to push on into more of the book, but we'll just leave it here at establishing despair, the types of despair, and the stages of despair in a man.